What we're doing is lifting up billions of people out of the bottom of the hierarchy, economically and so on. And we're doing this without inflicting revenge on any of the countries that caused the damage, without invading or colonizing or enslaving any other nation, and without throwing our own people under the bus. Colonialism was violent, abusive, extractive, hierarchical. It was never designed to protect human rights. It was never designed to industrialize Tunisia or Africa. It took most countries 50 years to realize that they were governing their entire system with a colonial mindset, colonial bureaucracy and administration. Decolonization is not just an economic decolonization. It starts first by decolonizing the mind, decolonizing our own education, our own thinking.
Thank you, Professor, for accepting our invitation and welcome to the show.
Asema, thank you for having me.
So you are here in Tunisia as part of the Green Lecture organized by the Heinrich Böll Foundation. I attended your lecture yesterday, and it was truly enriching opportunity to better understand this backstage of the global system. Mm-hmm. So let's jump directly into the first questions. The current structure of the global system is deeply shaped by its colonial past, right? So how do we prevent decolonizing from turning into a permanent narrative of victimhood?
Very good question. First, let's be very clear about this narrative of victimhood, because it's a very important point of criticism. People don't like the narrative of victimhood. People say, we don't want to be the victim. We don't want to ask for charity. We don't want to ask for help. We're not victims. We're sovereign. We're strong and everything. But if I'm walking in the street here outside this building, and you're driving with your car and you hit me and you break my leg, and I go in the hospital for 3 weeks, and then I have to do physical therapy to recover, I'm a victim of this accident, especially if you did it on purpose. Okay. You saw me crossing and you accelerate and you hit me. I'm not going to be ashamed to say that I'm a victim of an accident, and I'm going to go to court and bring you to court, and the court should rule in my favor in this case. There's nothing wrong with that. Mm-hmm. There's nothing wrong with being a victim and saying I was a victim, or I am still a victim of a particular crime or of a particular event that happened. But the discussion about we don't want the narrative of victimhood is a belief, a neo-colonial belief that is actually imposed from outside, from those who created the problem, that colonialism is a thing of the past. It finished. We're now free, and we should stop complaining. Don't complain about the past. Look, you're free. You have your own country, your own resources, your own government, your own flag, your own military. What are you complaining about? Don't be the victim, mm-hmm. right? This is the myth. And what I try to demonstrate in my work, and I said it yesterday in the Green Lecture, I said, when I say colonialism, economic colonialism, I'm not talking about the past. I'm talking about today's economic system that is still colonial. And that's why the narrative of victimhood is not a rhetorical reference. It's a technical economic description of economic crimes that are being committed as we speak, economic structures of extractivism. So colonialism in the past, under actual colonial times, imposed on us here in Tunisia and the rest of the African continent and most of the global south, 3 economic functions, economic roles for Africa, for Tunisia, for colonized countries to play. The first economic role of the colonies was to produce cheap raw materials to export to the industrialized world. We still play the role today. So we still play the same colonial role. So that didn't change. Number 2, the colonies were supposed to be the consumers, not the producers, the consumers of industrial output and technologies from the industrialized world. We still do that to this day. So that economic colonial role didn't change. So we still have colonial structure. And number 3, and most importantly, this is the last one, Africa and the colonies were supposed to be the place where obsolete technologies, assembly line manufacturing that is no longer needed in the industrialized world, is outsourced to us to be assembled with low-cost labor under the guise of development, cooperation, we're partners. But in reality, what it does is that it locks us permanently at the bottom of the hierarchy, at the bottom of the industrial hierarchy, at the bottom of the global value chain, at the bottom of the geopolitical hierarchy. And we still play that role to this day. We assemble manufacturing products for the global north.
Is it not the beginning of China revolution? Is staying in like bottom of the hierarchy in the industrial world. Mm-hmm. So they serve like, producing without any big picture of the supply chain.
That's where they started.
Yeah.
But with the intention of not staying there. The Chinese model is very interesting. So the 3 colonial roles, they still persist here in Africa. But China started with the same thing. But they had a long-term strategic transformation vision to escape the bottom of the value chain. So part of their strategy was to industrialize. You start with assembly. You train your labor force to do assembly at low cost, at high speed, at high quality. And you just assemble stuff. And then you invite foreign companies from the US, from Europe, and say, if you want to come manufacture here with our workers, high speed, low cost, at large scale, and if you want to have access to our large market, 1.5 billion consumers, you can, but you have to share your technology with us. 50-50, joint venture. So if you want to come here, give us some technology. Little by little, they take the technology, they move up the value chain, so they're not locked at the bottom. They improve the technology, they invest in research and development, engineering. China, for the last 30 years, they produce 1.5 million engineers, MIT level, MIT caliber engineers. That's how you build an industrial revolution, with science, with research, with innovation. Transfer of technology, at scale production, and slowly moving from the bottom of the value chain all the way to now dominating some key industries. Mm-hmm. Now tell me which country in Africa started at the bottom of the value chain and developed long-term strategic plan to escape the bottom of the value chain. We're still locked at the bottom of the value chain. So to conclude, our economic structure is still colonial, which means, if you remember, colonialism was not a system for development. Colonialism was never meant to introduce democracy. Colonialism was violent, abusive, extractive, hierarchical. It was never designed to protect human rights. It was never designed to industrialize Tunisia or Africa. So why do we today expect the exact same colonial functions somehow to give us democracy or human rights or industrialization or development? It's impossible by design. The economic structure cannot produce democracy or justice or development or industrialization. So if we're serious about industrialization, development, democracy, human rights, all the sustainable development goals for that matter, we have to undo those 3 economic functions. And that's why I say you can't decarbonize unless you decolonize the economy. You can't democratize unless you decolonize the economy. So that's the starting point for my analysis. So I have no problem saying that we are still the victims today of colonial economic structures. But with clarification, victims doesn't mean that we stop and do nothing and say, oh, we're the victims. We'll wait for the global north, for Europe, for the US, for China to come save us. That's a big mistake. Now, that's the narrative I reject. But learning that we're victims of a particular system of entrapment, and then recognizing that we have to fight to undo the traps of that system. But saying, oh, colonialism is finished, 1950s, we're free, don't say we're victims, that victimhood is old. is also misleading.
And then practically, I mean, the situation of today is like 100 years behind us. And then there is memories, there is land appropriation, there is contract, there is economic system. So we can imagine a decolonized process, but it's about generation.
It's an entire system. Decolonization is not just an economic decolonization. It starts first by decolonizing the mind, decolonizing our own education, our own thinking. I mean, even this question about the narrative of victimhood is a colonial mentality. And we see it even not just in Tunisian intellectual elites, but all over the African continent. There's intellectual elites, even in the global south, in India and other places. There's an elite intellectual class that rejects this narrative of victimhood from a pro-colonial perspective. Some of them even go as far as saying that maybe we need to be recolonized so that we can learn how to do things like the industrialized world, so that we can be disciplined, so we can be organized, so we can be technologically advanced. I mean, I've heard these things even in Tunisia with some highly educated experts in Tunisia and Kenya and India and other places. So that narrative is still there. So first is decolonizing the mind, because colonialism will never deliver these things that they dream of, development and industrialization. It's a lie, it's a myth. So decolonizing the mind, decolonizing education, decolonizing economic structures, it's not going to happen overnight. You have to inform, educate, empower, mobilize, organize in order to undo these structures. Well, I studied in Tunisia, like everybody here. If we didn't have a national holiday called Independence Day, 20th of March, my economics education didn't really teach me that we were actually colonized or that we were still colonized to some extent. My education, like everybody's education in the global south, is colonialism is finished. We became independent. Now we have our sovereign national policies. And that's it, that we should not complain about colonialism. That's a big problem. That's a narrative imposed by the global north. In fact, many countries in Africa where ministries of education try to change the curriculum that is taught in the classroom to young students to introduce history lessons about colonialism, about the development of the country under colonialism or the underdevelopment, they receive phone calls from ambassadors of France, of England, of Spain, of global north, saying, "Why are you doing this? This is not good for our relationships. You forgot that colonialism is over. Why are you teaching young people that they should hate us?" It's not about teaching hate. It's about teaching truth. It's about teaching history, so that you have a generation that grows up knowing that the work that our grandfathers and their generation did to liberate the land is one part of the process, and they left our generation and future generations with the more important job, which is to decolonize the economic structures, the unfinished business. And that's really the focus of my work, is how do we decolonize the economic structures? And this is not a new project that I invented a few days ago. This started on day one after independence, because the independence leaders in Tunisia and the rest of the continent, they were completely aware that they didn't finish the work when they have independence. They immediately knew that they need to decolonize the economy, to push the colonial economic interests out of the continent and to build sovereign economic structures that serve the economic interest of their people. Now, some of them made a little bit of progress, and then when they hit some critical red lines, they were either assassinated or pushed into exile or stopped in one way or another. All over the continent, because they were getting into a disruptive stage of the global economic hierarchy. So that work was silenced and stopped in the 70s, mostly. But that work sooner or later has to be done if we're serious about a global system of peace, justice, and sustainable prosperity. And that's especially in the ecological crisis that we're in. All the life-sustaining systems, the biodiversity system, the energy system, the water system, the food system, these are life-sustaining systems. They're breaking down. They're dying. So we're facing a situation of death, essentially, of an entire system of humanity. And one of the fundamental forces that is killing the biodiversity system, the energy system, the water system, is the kind of energy system that we built, which is fossil fuel dominated. The good news is that we have an alternative to fossil fuels today. The technology is available that can be unleashed on a massive scale. And Africa is the largest, the continent with the largest renewable energy potential. We have all the green minerals needed to manufacture and deploy everything we need. But we have no access to financing to unleash that potential. Africa receives 1% of financing for renewables globally, 1%, even though we have the largest potential. And there's no transfer of technology to manufacture and deploy the renewable energy infrastructure. Now, that transfer of technology, red line, and financing of renewables is not by accident, because unleashing the continent's potential to become the most powerful energy source, renewable energy source, means it becomes an industrial powerhouse, means it becomes an economic powerhouse, means we're no longer locked at the bottom of the hierarchy. We move higher in the hierarchy, we move at the center of a new world order. We see it as a potential win, as a potential victory, as a huge opportunity to address the climate crisis, the development challenges, job creation, everything. It's perfect. But if you're not the African continent, if you're a country at the top of the hierarchy, you perceive this as a threat to you. Certainly. You perceive this as a risk. What do you do with the threat? You eliminate it. What do you do with the risk? You minimize it. So no transfer of technology, no financing to keep the continent at the bottom of the hierarchy. Now that's a question of geopolitics and power, which means we have to, the process of decarbonization so that we can sustain the life-sustaining systems is a question of fighting global power that refuses to allow you to escape the bottom of the hierarchy. And there's a way to do it without confrontation, without violence. We're not talking about wars here. We're talking about how do you reposition yourself, assert yourself as a sovereign, independent, energy secure, water secure, biodiversity secure continent to protect life on the continent and life on Earth.
I mean, the scale of the continent, Africa, for me, it's really challenging. It's like a global scale. So how we, the leader, the political leader, the nation, the existing borders can converge, I mean, in one vision to work together to create some Pan-African optimistic future for together with the actual, dawn and realities. So it's a challenge. It's politically impossible in some situations.
Yeah. So the reality is that it's not going to be all African countries immediately jumping on this Pan-African vision for collaboration, joint industrial policy, and all that. It's certainly not going to be the African Union. Even though ideally the African Union is the place where we have all the negotiations, the bureaucracy, the decisions, but the African Union itself is deeply colonized. 50% of the African Union budget comes from the global north. So it's a heavily policed space. So I don't expect any real transformation to come under the current financial model of the African Union. It can be changed. The African Union can be financially independent and can become the platform for sovereign Pan-African decisions. But the reality, not today. So where do we start? We start with political leaders on the continent, not all of them, but a few, who have the courage to think and act differently. There are few. There are few who have at least that inclination, and there are few more who can be convinced and brought into this. And then if you successfully create a model of industrialization and development that works, let's say, for 15 countries, hypothetically, then all of a sudden those 15 countries start to deliver better quality of life, cheaper energy, industrial development to their people. And the rest of the continent, the population of the rest of the continent that didn't participate, will start noticing the difference, will want to join, will apply pressure on their leaders to leave the existing neo-colonial system and join the Pan-African system. But then, even countries that have border disputes, that have political disputes with each other, they'll realize when you sit and look at things on the table, you realize there's a huge win, a huge prize to win if you join this Pan-African joint industrial policy vision. But then these smaller, relatively smaller regional disputes, they appear much, much smaller in the bigger scheme of things. So then you can sit down diplomatically behind closed doors and negotiate a win-win scenario to save face, because nobody wants to come out after 20, 30 years of a conflict with a neighbor as the loser of the conflict, as you know, they got the upper hand and we lost. Mm-hmm. So you negotiate, look, we have a big win for both of us that we both want. And in order to do that, we have to close this old chapter. But we close it without appearing weak, without appearing like losers. So let's negotiate a victory for both of us and tell our public that we sorted out, we have a peace agreement or border agreement. It can be done. But today, because there is no big prize, the best way to appear strong domestically as a president is to show your people that you are not backing down against your neighbor for that small little dispute from 50 years ago, right? Mm. So there is a way diplomatically to minimize and eliminate a lot of the old disputes. I'll give you one quick example, because all of these disputes that we have on the continent, they're extremely small, like really extremely small in the bigger scheme of things. Think of Europe, the major wars, the millions of people that died in wars between Europeans who don't speak the same languages, right? Don't share the same history, right? Vicious wars between the British, the French, the Italians, everybody. But then after World War II, they realized that all that history of wars is not going to end if they keep going back to the same cycle.
They are smaller.
They're much smaller than us, but they have much vicious history of death and destruction, right? It could have continued after World War II. So they decided, if we build a European Union and have a big, strong economic, industrial, joint prosperity framework that creates a win-win for all of us, then that will be one way to stop having any incentive for invading each other and fighting each other. So the European Union was designed specifically to end centuries of conflicts and bloodshed. Mm. The European Union was not created because the French and the Germans like each other. I still think they don't like each other today. But they work together because they have to, because it's the bigger win is in working together. So if the French and the Germans,
they're different.
And the other, if they can sort out centuries of death and destruction and create this scenario where they speak with one voice, negotiate with one voice, and have all the strength that they have today, then for us on the African continent, our potential is much higher than them. Europe is a poor continent. They have no natural resources to speak of, no energy resources. Today, demographically, Europe is declining. And in terms of competitiveness, compared to the US and China in particular, Europe is not even on the map.
But they do have 300 years of institutional bodies and structural organization within their own countries and empires. So this pre-prepared situation allowed them in some points to converge. I mean, the situation in Africa and global South. So politically, generally it's dictatorships or so complicated situation. Security is not really.
Well, there's two things about dictatorships versus security issues. First of all, when we gained independence in the African continent, we inherited a governance structure that was colonial. You know, the governance during colonial times was not democratic. It was hierarchical, top-down administration. On day one after independence, we didn't transition to a new administration. We took the same skeleton of the colonial administration and we appointed our own people as an independent country to run the administration based on the same hierarchy, top-down hierarchy. Not just in Tunisia, but most of the global South, most of the former colonies. And that means we inherited the same colonial administration framework, right? We never democratized or decentralized that or invented our own model of governance, right? Some of that discussion came much, much later. Almost 50 years later, we started talking about decentralization, changing the administrative structure and all of that. So it took most countries 50 years to realize that they were governing their entire system with a colonial mindset, colonial bureaucracy and administration. That's one of the big problems. That's part of decolonizing governance too. But there's also, you know, we used to govern ourselves before colonial times.
Certainly.
We're much older civilizations across the global South, across the African continent. But that governance system was destroyed systematically during colonial times. And of course, naturally, after colonial times, it continues to be destroyed because we kept the same administration. So that process of inventing a new governance system that is truly decolonial is yet to be invented, is yet to be designed on non-colonial principles. And that requires a public discourse. That requires recognition. There's no shame in recognizing that we are still operating under a colonial economic structure or governance structure. It's okay, right? It's not, we don't have to hide it. But pretending it doesn't exist is a big problem. So if we can have a public discourse and invite the public, the media, civil society, the intellectual thinkers of the country to say, how do we co-design a well-functioning society, administration, governance that delivers justice and development and prosperity and democracy on our terms, even after, you know, the waves of democratizations that we've seen in parts of the global South, including in this country. Very often the first reaction is to import a democratic system from a European model of governance, a legal system and a political system, which may or may not work, right? We jump to democratizing the election process, transparency, freedom of speech, but we neglected one major thing, which is decolonizing the economy. We thought that if we have transparent elections and political parties and all of that, it will deliver prosperity. But it doesn't really work if you democratize the facade of the system, but it's deep structures, the economic structures continue to produce inequality, injustice, unemployment, right? The things that the youth were asking for, they wanted jobs, they wanted dignity, they wanted development, but the economic model that we have continued to give them exactly the opposite, continued to give them the exact colonial output, which is inequality, injustice, socioeconomic exclusion, and so on.
Yeah, I don't see even the end, because even internet can be decolonized. So all the new energy and technology. So it's like a big process and a big path. Let me come back to an idea that you shared for a common African, Pan-African industrialization with the focus on a clean energy.
Yeah.
So my question is how to make sure that reproducing the same industrial system, even if it's green, cannot be in the risk of reproducing some capitalistic pattern. Not in the same phase. It can be something else, but the pattern should be the same and reproduce the same injustice and the same climate risk and problems.
Very good question. So let's say hypothetically, and it's a big hypothetical, that we have maybe 30 African countries or global South countries with political leadership that agrees that we're going to have joint industrial policy. That's a big assumption because you have to have presidents, heads of states who agree to coordinate. Let's say we have that. And then we say, okay, what kind of industrial development do we want on non-colonial terms that actually protect nature, protect people, and give us, and don't reproduce the injustice of the existing model of industrialization that was used in the West, which means we, and it's the big we, not the presidents and governments, we meaning civil society groups, think tanks, academics, labor unions, frontline communities, vocational training associations, everybody who will be a stakeholder, a participant in industrial production, that's the big we, including governments, of course, including members of the private sector, the financing agencies from those countries. That's the big we. We have to sit down and co-create, co-design a joint industrial policy in which we pre-negotiate inside the blueprint, we pre-negotiate the distribution of the value chain, which means where are we going to place the manufacturing units? You have 30 countries, which means if we have an industrial policy that includes maybe South Africa and Tunisia and hypothetically Malawi, for example. South Africa is more advanced in terms of industrial production. After 30 years, we don't want to see South Africa at the top of the hierarchy and Malawi at the bottom of the hierarchy. How do we co-create a joint industrial policy in which Malawi actually develops and South Africa is not the most dominant and most advanced and then everybody else is at the bottom? That will be reproducing the injustice. So we pre-negotiate the distribution of the value chain and how we will build up capacity so that we equally benefit over time. We pre-negotiate the ownership structure because who's going to own these factories? How do we guarantee that some of the more profitable units, some of the lesser profitable units are sharing profits with joint ventures, shared ownership, so that the entire industrial plan succeeds and we don't end up with some units succeeding and some units failing and then the entire thing collapses. Right? So that's pre-negotiation of the ownership structure. We have to pre-negotiate the distribution of the wage and profit share between workers and owners, whoever the owners are. It could be private sector, it could be governments, and so on. That has to be pre-negotiated with labor rights protected, with human rights protected, with community rights protected, biodiversity rights protected, because if we're doing green industrialization, we're doing mining, we're extracting critical minerals. And we all know what's happening in extractivism and mining. Who are the victims of this green revolution, supposedly? It's the people who live in the ecosystem that is being destroyed in some cases with toxic materials. So we have to pre-negotiate all of this as part of the distribution of the value chain. We may have to designate some territories as unminable, untouchable for biodiversity reasons. So not everything that is potentially a mine should be mined. So all of that is our work to do, right? And then once you pre-negotiate all of that, you secure internal coherence and support from workers, from local communities, from funders, from vocational training associations, because you have to train the labor force that will create the jobs and the skills for the jobs that you want, the financing, the governance, the inter-country trade balances, all of that has to be pre-designed as part of a blueprint. That's how you guarantee that when presidents come and go, because they do come and go, that you have the integrity of the joint industrial policy in place, because it's co-owned by the people, by the participants, by the countries, and that includes sovereign wealth funds. Some countries have sovereign wealth funds that are co-investors in these joint industrial policies. And again, there's no reason for this to be only African. Some Latin American countries have interest in joining. Some Asian countries from the global south, even from the global north. There's no reason why a Spanish company that have high-tech equipment that is needed for the joint industrial policy not to be a participant by sharing technology on our terms, right? On Pan-African terms. So this is not an exclusive club. This is us designing our success model and then inviting the world to participate on our own terms.
Mm-hmm. I see the same model, very interesting, even on the scale of the nations. But I'm just questioning if there is any African nations is moving in this sustainable way of sharing and resources and inside their country. What's missing in nowadays to literally buy the technology? So if you have money, so you can buy technology.
Yeah.
And you are in some way independent.
Not completely, right? So this is the economics of industrialization is very important. So let's say we've done all this work. We've pre-negotiated the distribution of the value chain. We've pre-designed our joint industrial policy. We pay our workers with national currency, so we don't need to borrow dollars for that. Mm-hmm. We pay for our materials, minerals with our national currency, so there's no need to borrow dollars for that. Normally, you need to borrow dollars to import the machines, the technology, to manufacture the solar panels or the wind turbines or the high-speed train or whatever you want to build. And when you borrow money, the lenders will impose a particular model on you. They say, if you're going to borrow money from me, I want to make sure that you can pay me back in dollars on time, which means I want you to be export-oriented, export to some global market so that you earn dollars so that you pay me on time. And if we do all of this work to manufacture solar panels to be exported to some other country in the global north to be consumed, to be used, then we never build the sovereign energy system that we actually need. And a country like Tunisia will continue to import gas from Algeria. And the entire African continent will still have more than 600 million people with no access to electricity, which means we neglect the building blocks of development and prosperity, and we remain in the trap. So why do all of this work and then stay in the same trap? So borrowing money to import the technology is not going to be the solution. The solution is to use our collective economic and geopolitical weight as a bloc, as a very well-prepared bloc, and go to the countries that have the technology, the companies that have the technologies, and say, look, we offer you the bargain of the century. This is what I call the bargain of the century. Meaning, if you agree to come to this joint venture, accept all of our terms that we've pre-negotiated, share your technology, so in-kind contribution, not a loan, in-kind participation.
Minerals.
You bring your machines, your technology, your know-how, and you share your know-how to participate. We bring the minerals, we bring the workers, we bring the size of our market, and you bring the machines, the technology. And we co-create at scale the manufacturing capability for solar, for wind, for high-speed trains, for the infrastructure that we need to build for the continent, not for export. First to build what we need, and if we have more, we export more.
Just like what happened in Gulf countries when they start digging for oils.
To some extent, but it wasn't really a transfer of technology. It was more of this is what happened in China. China said, if you want to come here to our big market, you have to give us your technology. You have to participate with sharing technology. So here's what we offer you in return if you agree to that. This is the bargain of the century. If you agree to this, in 10 to 15 years, you can double your industrial footprint globally. You can double your economic and geopolitical weight globally. And you can, if you're a country doing this, you secure your access to these very precious minerals that everybody's panicking about today, the critical minerals. In addition to that, we as the African continent alone, if you join in this industrial policy, our population will have rising income levels because we're developing and industrializing. Africa, by the end of the century, will be a market of 4 billion consumers. The largest market on the planet. In less than 75 years, will be 4 billion consumers, which means we give you privileged access to the largest market on the planet with rising purchasing power. Any major economic bloc will want to have access to that market. Just like China said, if you want to have access to 1.5 billion consumers, you have to share your technology.
It's not the same logic of market and consuming.
It's a logic of markets. It's a logic of making. But no country alone can do this.
This is true.
Because we don't have 4 billion consumers in Tunisia, but as a continent we do. So that's why it has to be one strategy, one voice, on our own terms. And I guarantee you, because this technology we're talking about is available in China and Japan and the US and Germany and France. It's available everywhere, but they don't want to transfer the technology. But under this model, the country that will be most likely to accept the bargain first, the most likely country to share technology is China today. And it makes sense because it's not a big threat.
They are already here.
They're already here. It's not a big threat to them economically, technologically. And they want to have an advantage and the largest market on the planet. But the idea here of this bargain of the century is not to position China at the top of the hierarchy. It's to trigger the process to create a little bit of friendly fear, let's call it, in other countries and say, look, if you don't participate in the same kind of deal on these terms, you become the isolated global minority. You'll lose access to the largest market, and you'll actually allow China to become the dominant player in the world. So after we trigger this process with China, we go to other countries and say, we offer you the same deal. Share your wind turbine technology, share your geothermal technology, share your pharmaceutical technology on our terms. So we choose the technologies that we need for our own development. And you say, we want to manufacture and deploy on our terms on this continent or in the global south with your technology as a win-win scenario. There's plenty. 4 billion consumers is a large market. Everybody should participate. At that point, no country will refuse to share technology, because if they refuse, they become the isolated minority that is excluded from the largest market on the planet. Because the global south, the whole global south, not Africa, we're 80% of the global economy. 80% in terms of population. And increasingly, GDP-wise, will be the dominant economic bloc. So the traditional rich countries of the past century have the risk of becoming the minority population, the minority economic blocs. So they have a small window of opportunity to participate, because what we're trying to do here is to position Africa and the rest of the global south at the center of a new international economic order. So we're not trying to dominate. We're not trying to put any country at the top. We're trying to create a truly multilateral system, multipolar system, in which we rewrite the rules of international trade, international finance, international investment, international taxation on non-colonial terms. Because the rules of the entire international system were written either during colonial times or right after colonial times, on colonial principles. So decolonizing the global international economic system, this is the process to decolonize it. And nobody can decolonize it. It's not going to be the US, it's not going to be Europe, it's not going to be China. The only bloc of countries that has the incentive and the capacity to decolonize the global economic system is Africa and the rest of the global south. Because this, what I'm describing here, will not be gifted to us by the US or by Europe or by China or by anybody else. It has to be created by us.
And without making a war. So,
but this is the thing. What we're trying to do, if we succeed, and I believe it is possible, technically, politically, geopolitically, it's possible. If I didn't believe it, I wouldn't waste my time working on this. If we succeed in doing this, this is something that has never been done in the history of humanity. Because what we're doing is lifting up billions of people out of the bottom of the hierarchy, economically and so on. And we're doing this without inflicting revenge on any of the countries that caused the damage, without inflicting pain on any of the countries that caused the damage, without invading or colonizing or enslaving any other nation, and without throwing our own people under the bus. So we're inviting the rest of the world to join us in co-creating this new international economic order of peace, justice, and sustainable prosperity.
I like your optimistic energy and the ambition behind. I'm not an economist, so I cannot go deeply inside the details. But one of your key messages is the money and the monetary system. So just one question. Do you believe in the role of cryptocurrency to change? Can Africa build something on this logic?
The short answer is no, because cryptocurrencies, despite the name, gives the illusion of currency, money. Cryptocurrency is a speculative financial instrument.
But it's like shortcut dollars.
It's a shortcut for individuals to speculate, just like you speculate on any commodity in the market. You buy low, you sell high, you hope that you get lucky in your investment strategy. And some people win and some people lose.
But it's based on trust. So if all African countries trust one cryptocurrency, so there is a value behind.
But it's not a sovereign currency. There's no national or Pan-African entity that controls the issuance of the currency. We have other financial models that are based on sovereign national currencies that can get us there. Unfortunately, the rise of cryptocurrencies is the result of the existing economic and financial model failing so badly, forcing individuals and countries to go to desperate measures to find any almost gambling scheme to generate financial resources. And cryptocurrencies became the latest innovation. But it's not a sustainable model of financing. It's not a sustainable model of development. Even countries that actually tried it, developing countries that tried it.
Which country?
The country that used it the most or pushed for it the most in Central America is blanking on the name now.
Ecuador?
No, not Ecuador. Ecuador is dollarized. They use the dollar. I'll remember in a minute. You're gonna have to fill it in the podcast. Right. It's not Honduras. It's close to Honduras. It escaped me.
Okay. Anyway.
But the country that used it the most, after 2 or 3 years, they completely shut it down. They realized it's not working because money is the least important component, actually, of economic development. I know this is a very difficult thing to believe. The most important component of the process of economic development is having the physical resources, having the technological resources, having the know-how, and the productive capacity.
And the power on them. You have the power on your resources.
Of course. If you don't have them, you have to import them. Then money becomes a problem. But then you borrow money, and then you're in debt, and then the lender controls your priorities, right? So the priority is to build your own productive capacity. That's why one of the biggest sources of external debt that we have in Africa and Tunisia included is imports of energy, imports of food, and of course no country can function without food and without fuel, and imports of high value added manufactured goods, technology, right? These are the basic building blocks of development. So that's why I always say your first priority is to secure the highest degree of food sovereignty. You produce the food that your people actually need to consume. But unfortunately, most of the global south, we were forced into a system where we have to produce tomatoes and bananas and watermelons and olives and for exports. And then what do we import? The actual food security items. We import the wheat, we import the rice, we import the sugar, we import the things that we actually need for consumption. That's the wrong model of economic development. We're constantly borrowing money to feed ourselves.
So build the barriers between countries.
Exactly. And the energy system, this is the opportunity. One of the best ways to invest in food sovereignty is our mechanisms are actually completely consistent with protection of biodiversity, agroecology, because you use less water, you use native seeds that don't need more irrigation, that don't need foreign pesticides, that don't need fertilizers as much. There's an entire model of agricultural sustainability that can feed an entire nation with the correct strategy that minimizes the imports of fertilizers and pesticides and petrochemicals. Like now with the conflict in Iran, all the fertilizers, there's global shortage of fertilizers because we use petrochemicals for fertilizers. So that's a win if we do this the correct way, a win in terms of debt, solving the debt problem, solving an ecological problem, and decolonizing our economy. Because the more sovereign our economic system, the more policy options we have. The second source of external borrowing is fuel imports. We know this in Tunisia, we're huge energy deficit, but it's not unique to Tunisia. The entire African continent, including the biggest oil exporters on the continent, because they export crude and then they import the refined petrochemicals. The good news is that every green kilowatt hour you produce locally, from solar, from wind, from hydro, every green kilowatt hour will reduce the amount of dollars you have to borrow to import fuel and the amount of interest you have to pay for 20, 30 years sometimes on that debt. So that's a solution to the debt problem. It's a sustainability solution. It's a national economic sovereignty solution. And that gives you all of those dollars that you're not spending on fuel imports. You can spend them on health, on education, on research and development. And we do this every day. We import food, we import fuel, we import food, we import fuel. All of that money is going and disappearing every day. So once we invest in securing food sovereignty, energy sovereignty for us as a priority before we export, then we can have the fiscal capacity to build everything else we want. And that's why there's these debates. I mean, the African continent, Tunisia included, of course, we have massive renewable energy potential. I mean, that's why everybody wants to invest in our desert for green hydrogen, for solar, because the cost of producing electricity, clean electricity here is so cheap, which means we have a potential not only of securing 100% of our electricity needs for the average Tunisian to have the cheapest electric bill on the planet. We have that potential, can be done very quickly. Just to give you a number, our overall consumption of electricity, I think the last time I checked the number is 6 gigawatts, more or less. Let's say 6, 7. I checked the speed at which China is big and everything, how quickly they deploy 6 gigawatts. 6 days.
Oh.
In 6 days.
From all the supply chain?
No. Installation.
Oh.
Right? Now, we don't have to do it in 6 days. Let's do it in 6 years. Let's do it in 60 years. But let's have a plan to have fully 100% green, cheap electricity produced in Tunisia. We don't have a plan for that. But instead, we have planned to produce a little bit of electricity to export to Europe. That's the wrong plan.
Yeah, but in the same time, I'm saying that they will not allow us.
Who is they?
Who has the power?
Who has the power?
Countries has the power. So I will give you something.
No. There's no such thing as countries have the power. We're
the system is disbalanced. The system, I mean.
But we don't stop trying, and we don't stop strategizing, and we do have some leverage.
There is a key fundamental position that we have to think about. For example, there is like an unfair or injustice in the way that the big organization works, and the way that, for example, the economic sanctions. Imagine if one or two or bunch of countries in Africa try to do something, and then the American sanctions.
Okay.
Nobody can deal with these countries. So this principle, for example, the veto
power,
even the concept of sovereignty the fact that you allow yourself in your name of your own sovereignty to go outside your border.
Yeah.
So these are principles that not allowing easily this vision. I mean,
there's a way to deal with that. So let's go back to our Pan-African industrial policy. And that is going to be perceived as a threat to outside economic blocs, because now you're truly disrupting the geopolitical hierarchy. You should not do this without being prepared for the external pressure. So the external pressure, historically, we know what kind of external pressure.
And internal also.
Internal too, from vested interest, from business
security
interest.
And all
exactly. But let's start with the external/internal pressure. One of the things that will happen, because we've seen this historically, is the pressure points, your vulnerabilities, will be your weakest points. What are our weakest points? Debt payments, food imports, fuel imports, medical imports. Military, I'll leave military until the end, but I'm not forgetting it because it's important. But let's start with food and fuel and medical necessities. You should not engage in this bargain of the century that I described before you secure internally within the bloc collective self-reliance to secure each other's food supply lines, fuel supply lines, medical supply lines, either internally within the bloc or with external partners. It's extremely important. And you need to have a security pact for the external, because some presidents have been assassinated for trying this.
Thomas Sankara.
So, but here's the thing. This bloc of Pan-African Global South countries will start the process. Let's say it includes South Africa. Let's say it includes Brazil. Big Global South countries. And I think it should be. And politically, I think they're aligned with this vision. Yeah, at the moment. Triggering the bargain of the century with China is not just because they're more willing to share technology. It's also strategic, because if you have China, Brazil, and South Africa as part of this agreement, then you have a core component of BRICS in here, which means you start to rewire the thinking of BRICS as an economic bloc in terms of actual decolonial transformation. Because BRICS today is not a decolonial bloc. BRICS
the same model
is a mercantilist, trade-oriented, export-oriented bloc, which is okay. But it's not going to be the thing that will change the world on Global South African terms. It works for the 5 countries that started it. But engaging in BRICS, engaging in China, and then through Brazil and South Africa, you can start to rewire the thinking of BRICS, because I think this strategy will strengthen BRICS even more and will bring a larger Global South bloc to it. The global majority will become engaged directly in BRICS. And once you engage in discussions about securing food supply lines, fuel supply lines, medical supply lines, and a security pact with an economic bloc that includes China, that includes Russia, that includes everybody else, and all of a sudden you have the equivalent or the counterweight to NATO. And that's what it takes. Because if this is about a global hierarchy that refuses to be disrupted, it refuses to be disrupted economically, geopolitically, in every territory.
So it needs to be protected militarily.
This is not a confrontational approach. This is an assertive approach that says we sovereign nations have the right to exist, to prosper, to develop, not to dominate, but to be at the center of the world. We're the global majority. And as part of our development, we will make sure that we protect our interests. Every country has a right to protect its borders, to protect its interest, economic interests. So do we. So that has to be part of it. It will be naive to do all of this work thinking that it will be left alone. Because the reality is that the current geopolitical hierarchy, which is a colonial hierarchy, still operates with a colonial mentality. I mean, this is not me saying it. Listen to political leaders from countries at the top of the hierarchy and what they tell us every day. listen even to President Macron the last few days in Nairobi. What did he say? He said, we are the real Pan-Africanists. The country that assassinated Sankara, the country that participated in the assassination and overthrowing of so many Pan-African governments. Today, their president is telling us that he is the real Pan-Africanist. That's the most insulting thing that has ever been said on the African continent. So
yeah, there is a lot of critics even inside France for his speech.
I think he did a lot of damage to France itself with his statements.
Yeah, these days Trump is in China to meet Xi Jinping. How you can predict what will happen next? Do you think that this crisis, let's say a Trump shock, will continue? It's a threat to African countries, to developed countries, global south, or it can be opportunities?
Very good question. So I'll start with the concept of a Trump shock and a Trump moment. And then I'll go to the opportunities and the risks. There's a big mistake that some people make in thinking that this is just a temporary thing associated with the Trump administration, that supposedly after the Trump administration goes away and the US has another kind of quote unquote normal president and normal White House, things will go back to normal. That's a big mistake. There is, in a sense, what Trump is doing is a continuation of US foreign policy, just with a very ugly face, with very ugly method, very aggressive. I don't see major differences between several US administrations. I see continuity, but Trump brings, removes the facade and kind of in your face, this is what we're actually doing. So that's point number one. Point number two, there is no going back, because to their credit, to some extent, the Trump administration and before him, even the Biden administration, they both recognize that the US dominance in the global economy and militarily also is not going to last forever. Is being severely challenged by China. China economically is already exceeding the United States. Technologically, in some key sectors, is already exceeding the United States. In terms of infrastructure development, if you go to China versus the United States, it's already exceeding the United States in so many areas.
Pretty new infrastructure.
The area where the US still has some advantage to this day is military capabilities. Its navy and its military capabilities. And after the conflict with Iran, we've seen even that is not apparently the top of the game. Even a country like Iran was able to challenge strategically US dominance in at least in terms of air power, with very asymmetrical. But the point is, the US recognized that the rising power that will contest its dominance is clearly going to be China. It's not Europe, it's not Russia, it's not anybody else. So one of the key areas technologically where the US still has the potential to catch up and exceed China and leave China behind is high-tech AI infrastructure, AI development, even though China is very advanced in that space. AI is very energy intensive. China is energy dependent. And China recognized the fact that they're energy dependent a long time ago, which is why China was investing in renewables. But at the same time, China investing in coal power plants. A lot of people were confused. Why are you investing in renewables and in coal? Well, because coal, they can have it domestically. Renewables, they can have it domestically. They wanted energy sovereignty. The justification is that it's climate, but also it's an industrialization opportunity for them. Green industry, they dominate everything. China is dependent on oil imports, as we know, from Iran, which is part of the conflict, from Venezuela, from other parts of the world. So slowing down the Chinese economic engine, the Chinese high-tech engine, is creating choke points for oil supply lines. So that's one thing. The US is hoping to slow down Chinese advances in the AI technology sector, because AI is applied in industrial manufacturing. It's applied in surveillance and high-tech spying and military technology. So that's a huge strategic sector for the US. In the meantime, the US is hoping to rapidly increase its investments in the AI sector, primarily in military, primarily in surveillance, to keep a competitive edge over the Chinese, which is why you see the big tech companies in the US are the ones who are the closest to the US administration and the most privileged small group of billionaires, because they fit into that strategy.
Yeah, they are also in China now.
And they flew in the same presidential plane with Donald Trump, landed in China on the same, because it's a strategic sector, right? So that's the intense competition that we see globally between China and the US, is who's going to come out of the next 5 to 10 years on top of the game. And that's unfolding as we speak. So when you look at smaller pieces of the puzzle on the global geopolitical map, Venezuela, Iran, Israel, Palestine, Taiwan, the Strait of Malacca, all of these things are small pieces of a large puzzle of competition for dominance between the US and China. China has an advantage historically in terms of the way they think, the way they govern. China is always thinking long term. Long term is 50, 100 years minimum, right? China has a political system that's very stable, that doesn't blink, that doesn't panic when there's small events, relatively small events. The US system is changing every 4 years, potentially, even domestically changing every 2 years with midterm elections. It tends to be much more reactive and nervous. There's some long-term thinking, but a lot of the short-term approach tends to disrupt long-term visions. So very different models of governance, of strategies. And you can see it in terms of how these countries react to global conflicts.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you, Steve. Thank you, Professor.
Thank you for having me. It's a pleasure.
To share with us all these interesting ideas and thoughts.